Hey guys, well, let's get right to it. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get right into our presentation. Here we are in our futuristic classroom. So here's the reminder that we have a playlist called Module 1 Inductive Bible Study. It's in chronological, how it developed over the years. In real life ministry situations, teaching from my church and things like that. So y'all might benefit from that. But we're primarily using this textbook right here. This was written in 1990, but it's very foundational as far as influence in other books and methodology, in particular Dallas Theological Seminary. So we've already gone through we're in part 1, Bible study and hermeneutics. We've already gone through inductive Bible study and hermeneutics, the differences, the goal of interpretation. We went through the hermeneutical considerations of the goal of interpretation. And today we're going to be dealing with the objections to the proposed goal of interpretation. Now, 10 years later, as I showed y'all last night from another book in the previous thing we went over, we saw Elliot Johnson defending literal interpretation at that time. So you can always go back and look at that. But I want y'all to hear the objections, because the more the things, there's a lot of similarities in postmodernism about what was going on with the objections. And I think it helps us appreciate literal interpretation for what it is, in opposed to these other views. Okay, here we go. Objections to the proposed goal of interpretation. Nearly every book of the Bible contains passages that have been interpreted in completely different and even incompatible ways. Disagreements over interpretation can often be traced not to differences in exegetical and theological method, but to a more fundamental cause. Let me check my sound. The goal of interpretation. A goal has such far-reaching effects on the interpretation that even using a common method would not prevent interpreters from coming to different conclusions. Thus, in part 1, we have given considerable attention to clearly distinguishing our goal of interpretation from other goals to clarify concerning the hermeneutical aspects of the goal. This chapter will deal with several objections to the goal of interpretation we have proposed. By way of review, our proposed goal is to determine the single or unifying meaning of the text that the divine author and human author intended to communicate. We have defined our terms and have dealt with hermeneutical questions related to the goal. The final step will be to defend that goal against objections that can be and are often raised. Our defense of the stated goal of interpretation centers on the answer to two fundamental questions. The first question, does the text communicate meaning? I would say yes, it does. Our goal asserts that there's a single unifying meaning in each literary unit. This thought was derived from convictions emerging from the literal tradition. If an author is going to communicate meaning that can be understood and known to be true, then all the component meanings must be capable of textual relationship to a unifying and comprehensive meaning. An enigmatic or equivocal meaning in composition cannot communicate truth. Textually unrelated meanings can never be known from textual clues alone. In biblical communication, one unified and coherent textual meaning is necessary for theological reasons, which we will identify. In the meantime, we confront the second question. What determines the meaning of the text? I would argue that it's what the author wrote in the text. The assertion that the divine author, human author's intention, as expressed in the text, determines the meaning has raised several objections. Some arise from the theoretical discussion of the proposed goal. Others arise from a practical evaluation of the process of how readers attempt to reach their goal in the interpretive process. 8 objections in all will be considered. Objection number 1. The goal interpreting a single, unified, coherent textual meaning is unnecessary because God is free to communicate as he chooses. The question has been raised whether God is bound by constraints of normal human communication. Is God governed by the constraints of human convention and human linguistic form? Does this not put an artificial constraint on God? Or does his desire to communicate with mankind not subject God to the shared dimensions of human communication? It will be argued that God's character and God's way with his creation necessarily limit him if he intends to communicate with mankind. There are at least 4 reasons for this. The go is necessary because of the condition of mankind. If God created mankind to know him, it is necessary that when God speaks, mankind can understand and know what his words mean. While there may be other aspects of man's knowing God, this knowledge is not less than verbal, since God has spoken. For verbal communication to exist, verbal meaning must be shared between God and mankind. These meanings are distinct from intuitive or private kinds of meaning that are independent from what God and mankind share in the text. Shared knowledge must be based on and determined by the text they share. For a man to be able to know the textual meanings, these meanings must be related to one another in a textually unified whole. If there were unrelated meanings, they would of necessity be determined by something unrelated to the text. Thus, the text must communicate a unified meaning composed of related meanings, in order that humans can know what God has spoken to them. 2. The go is necessary because of the veracity of God, the truthfulness of God. If God speaks truth, then it's necessary that the meaning can be recognized as true. The primary meaning must be shared with component meanings that are unified, related, and non-contradictory. If the meaning is true, then a statement may mean A or non-A, but it cannot mean A and non-A. It can be or, not and. The same statement cannot mean contradictory meanings at the same time and in the same context. So the textual meaning must necessarily be unified and coherent in the sense of consisting of textually related and non-contradictory meanings. C. The go is necessary because of the righteous authority of God. If God judges mankind in righteous judgment, and he does, then he honors man's right to know what he is responsible for. While there may be varying terms of responsibility, for some it means an obligation toward verbal revelation. That's where it talks about conscience in Romans 2. This implies that man is not only capable of knowing, but also capable of knowing that he knows. This in turn requires the presence of a single meaning that is textually determined. Differences as to what the textual meaning is can be weighed according to textual support for a given instruction. A meaning that can be textually validated then becomes a righteous basis for God's authoritative judgment. D. The go is necessary because of the condition of God's creation. Mankind's knowledge of God's creation consistently offers evidence for unity existing amid complexity. The world within creation is identified as a universe rather than a multiverse, in spite of the complexity. Mankind's practice of classifying and categorizing the natural world evidences the generic unity of the kinds of God's creation. The very character of human language witnesses to mankind's innate view of life as one in many. Even as Adam named the creation and could speak about the creation with God and with other humans. Is it not then natural, in fact, necessary to expect the creative revelation of God to be a unified arrangement of related components? This expectation is further supported in the practice of exegesis by those who treat the Bible's literary composition as a unity. Indeed, if God's creative work is a coherent unit involving diverse complexity, then of necessity his revelation of mankind must also be treated as a unity with related and non-contradictory components. Objection number 2. The author's attention is an unstable go because the meaning of the text changes in history and even in time may change for an author. In the first aspect of this two-pronged objection, a number of theories of textual meaning claim the meaning of the text changes. Renee Wellick and Austin Warren declared this in their work, Theory of Literature. In the late 18th century, Johann Gottfried Herder challenged the previously accepted assumption that human nature is essentially the same in all times and places. The result of this challenge was a view of history called historicism, which holds that a text's meaning changes in essence from era to era. While we recognize that there have been different interpretations of a text in different eras, we assert that a text must be read within the historical setting in which it was written, and we do not accept the conclusion of the radical historicists that the meaning of a text is essentially different from era to era. E.D. Hirsch has identified three fallacies inherent in the radical historicist view and relevant to biblical interpretation. The fallacy of assuming that the past is inscrutable. The radical historicist position maintains that the past is so different from our time that its text can only be understood by initiated few. Hans Georg Gadamer was rightly critical of Schleiermacher for importing 19th century rational ideas into interpretation while ignoring the concrete historical facts of the past. But at the same time, he conceded that one is set within what various traditions mean really and primarily that one is subject to prejudices and limited in one's freedom. Gadamer meant by this that an interpreter's foreconception or prior knowledge of the subject informs, what typically is called pre-understanding nowadays, and even distorts his understanding every time he reads about the subject in whatever historical tradition. Thus, limiting a reader to his own historical understanding implies that certain things in the past are innately inscrutable to modern man. The historicist's remedy to this is to modernize the meaning. An antidote to this historical fallacy, however, is to be found in Edmund Husserl's distinction between perception and the object perceived. He argued that historical objects do not change in time, and that modern man needs to reconstruct his perceptions consistent with what is known of the ancient object. B. The fallacy of assuming that the past is homogeneous. Another historical perspective argues that biblical interpretation often stresses the homogeneity of a historical period, the sameness between periods of history, without placing a corresponding stress on individuality within that period. The line of reasoning typically takes the form of a syllogism such as following. The Stoics use logos to mean the mind of God, guiding, controlling, and directing all things. The Apostle John used logos to mean the source of creation. Therefore, the Apostle John built on Stoical thought. The weakness of this type of argument is that it fails to examine the text for John's particular usage, which may be distinct from Stoic thought. This weakness can also be seen in the works of scholars belonging to the history of religion school. This approach to the New Testament endeavored to set the religious presuppositions of primitive Christianity in their contemporary Near Eastern and Greco-Roman context, and promised at one time to provide powerful helps toward its primitive Christianity interpretation. It is evident here again that any assumed homogeneity must also be demonstrated by the historical usage of the author in the Bible's text. Old Testament studies that employ cognate languages to increase modern man's knowledge of obscure Hebrew words must recognize that the investigations offer the interpreter only possible and potential meaning. The actual meaning must be established in the context of the author's usage. This limitation potentially applies to shared concepts used in the Ugaritic or Arabic or Akkadian sources. Even studies of the meaning of phrases or clauses that share common constructions with cognate languages must discover actual meanings of the construction and biblical usage in the canonical context. Hans Walter Wolff recognized this. For example, as he wrote, Israel showed itself to be concerned with the demytholization of death, which in view of the country's neighbors appeared both different and essential for the believer in Yahweh, and usually talk about the descent into Sheol as the word of the dead means no more than an indication of a burial at the end of life. Psalm 16:10. The translators of the New King James Version of Psalm 16:10 left open the possibility more than grave was meant, and so they translated the Hebrew Sheol, implying a technical term and revelatory content. The sense of Sheol may add to the culturally shared sense of grave, and this added sense will be based on what had been revealed about death as the judgment of God in Genesis 2 and 5. A major emphasis on hermeneutics in the 19th and 20th century has been to define the historical setting of biblical literature as the context within which a term or construction is to be understood. This approach has demonstrated 1. The necessity of historical analogy to avoid modernizing, and 2. The danger of drawing parallels where similarity is only superficial. Such historical investigation is valid and at times necessary, but it must avoid the assumption of homogeneous past. C. The fallacy assuming that the present is homogeneous with the past. The assumption that our present perspective is homogeneous with the past is a construction as artificial as any reconstruction of the past. However, such an assumption is frequently made. For example, Rudolf Bultmann constantly asserted that the essence of biblical message is concerned with human existence, and that human existence is the central issue with which contemporary man is essentially concerned. Therefore, Bultmann argued, since existential concerns are the primary concern of modern man, he will find the answer in the New Testament, provided all the non-essential stumbling blocks have been removed from the New Testament by the demytholization program. Gadamer offers the basis for such an approach when he says, "We see here again that understanding means primarily to understand the content of what is said, and only secondarily to isolate and understand another's meaning as such. Hence, the first of all hermeneutic requirement remains one's own foreunderstanding or pre-understanding, which proceeds from being concerned with the same subject." This contention that the author's meaning is unstable rests on certain assumptions about mankind's knowledge of the historical past. But these assumptions are by no means necessary. The fallacy of historicism rests in these erroneous views of the past. Historicism is in part a reaction against the danger of modernization of the biblical text and an attempt to deal with the limits of man's historical knowledge. The ancient biblical text, although composed over a period of almost 2,000 years, is itself not necessarily alien to us, even though it is at times admittedly distant and foreign. The capacity of the human consciousness to imagine worlds and historical errors other than one's own enables the interpreter to overcome many problems of ancient communication. Such imagined shifts in thought are possible because they are fundamental and parallel experiences in human existence that are enhanced in biblical revelation by the presence of an unchanging God. Note that this capacity of the human consciousness does not mean that there are no problems in historical understanding of the text. The absence of supporting historical data both inside and outside the biblical text, however, is not a sufficient basis on which to assume either an inscrutable past or homogeneity in the past. The principle of stable and knowable historical meaning is not overturned by difficulties in establishing particular historical meanings. Now, having dealt with the first aspect of the objection, that is, that text meaning can change, historically we must consider the related statements that the meaning can change for an author over time. There are 3 points that refute this position. First, there's an important distinction between revising the text and changing the text or meaning of what was originally said. Revision may be undertaken, 1, to clarify the original statement, or 2, to repudiate the original statement and replace it by another. Such textual revisions by an author do not change the textual meaning even for himself. Remember, he's speaking in general about literature. Second, there's an important distinction between textual meaning and an author's response to the text. Hirsch notes that the phenomenon of changing authorial responses is important because it illustrates the difference between textual meaning and what is loosely termed a response to the text. An author may see what he once wrote in a new light and recognize it as being inadequate, wrong, or confusing. But to reject what once said is not to say that the meaning of what was said has changed. Indeed, the very fact that we can make a distinction in meaning acknowledges that the original meaning is stable and has not changed. Third, Hirsch distinguishes between the meaning of a text, which does not change, and the significance of a text, which may change. Meaning is that which is represented by a text. It is what the author meant by his use of a particular sign sequence. It is what the signs represent. Significance, on the other hand, names a relationship between the meaning and a person, or a conception, or a situation, or indeed anything imaginable. Authors who, like everyone else, change their attitudes, feelings, opinions, and value criteria in the course of time tend to view their own work in different contexts. Clearly, what changes for them is not the meaning of the work, but rather their relationship to that meaning. Thus, the arguments for a change in meaning over time can be eliminated by 1. Clarifying the nature of apparent changes that occur, and 2. Establishing that the author's intention expressed in the text does not change for the author. We may therefore conclude that since the author's intention is stable, the goal of interpreting that intention is also stable. Objection number 3. The author's intention is an irrelevant goal because the issue is not what an author means, but only what the text says. This objection has been defended in 2 ways. A. Semantic autonomy. T.S. Eliot propounded in Tradition and the Individual Talent the theory of semantic autonomy, which in essence states that the meaning of written language is impersonal, objective, and independent of the life of its author. Eliot based his theory on 2 grounds. 1, the author has no control over the words he's loosed upon the world, and 2, he has no special privilege as an interpreter of them. 2, the author's success. Yeah, this is that idea that just because you intend to do something doesn't mean you actually complete it. Wimsatt and Beardsley wrote, the author's desire to communicate a particular meaning is not necessarily the same as his success at doing so. Since his actual performance is presented in his text, any special attempt to divine his intention would falsely equate his private wish with his public accomplishment. These 2 arguments are formal defenses for the consideration of a text separated from its author and do not have direct influence on biblical study. Keep that in mind. So let's go around Robin Hood's barn and respond to them. Most exegetical commentaries and articles about biblical texts focus on verbal meaning and verbal forms. Generally absent from these discussions is any consideration of the author's role in communication. Thus, an extensive body of literature virtually ignores the author as having any determinative role in their own usage and meaning. James M. Robinson correctly observes that what is normally treated in the discipline called hermeneutics is the discussion of the language of the text. For example, Bauer asserted in his lexicon, it is the purpose of this lexicon to facilitate the understanding of texts that were composed in the late Greek described above. In his fine introductory grammar, Eugene Goetius wrote, grammar, the system of formal structured devices or rules which a language uses to indicate the relationship between words and arrangement of words. It enables us to understand what words mean in particular contexts, and hence to understand at least to some extent what a word means before we look it up in a dictionary, and to choose correctly from among the sort of meanings which a dictionary offers. Underlying this understanding of verbal meaning is the insistence that a close correlation must exist between form and meaning. The nature of this correlation is important. Many interpreters accept the unstated assumption that Hirsch has verbalized. If the rules and canons of construction are made precise, and if the tools of linguistic analysis are sharpened and refined, the problem of interpretation will be resolved into operational procedures. Further support for this perception that the task of interpretation is merely linguistic and textual. Now, this is where I think Corey Minor kind of defaults at sometimes. Sometimes found in the doctrine of verbal plenary inspiration. Since the very words of the biblical text are so critical, a simple consideration of them and their grammatical relation is sufficient to disclose their meaning. Thus, in practice, the author's intention becomes irrelevant to the task of interpretation. This unstated assumption can be easily shown to be invalid by considering the case of irony. Yeah, because when you're reading irony, it's very hard to tell when someone is being ironic or sarcastic, because the words look the same. The presence or absence of irony, we indicated through tone. The presence or absence of irony changes nothing in the text except its fundamental meaning. Many of the parables, thank you, Linda. Thank you for the blessing and Merry Christmas to you also. Many of the parables of Jesus are full of irony. He told them in order to make one audience understand a different meaning from another. Matthew 13. Therefore, it is fundamental error to assume that the particular meaning of a text is directly and completely revealed in the text or form and style apart from a consideration of the author's context. Hirsch has argued against this unstated assumption in a discussion of stylistic and synonymity. In other words, synonyms. His argument for synonymity does not rest on the criterion of universal suitability proposed by the analytic philosophers, but on the criterion of occasional suitability of common speech. In other words, practical synonymity exists at several levels. At the level of the morpheme, that's the parts of a word, the various forms and highly variable relations between form and meaning are synonymous, like oo, ice, as an alternative genitive form in Greek, or dt and ed as past tense markers in English. So that's just a form. Two, at the level of stylistic choice or at the level of lexical choice, two words in particular uses may be completely synonymous. For example, I don't know what that word is in Greek, or jacket and coat in English. At three, at the syntactic level, although this is more complex, there are contexts where distinct forms are synonymous. Now, this is interesting. This is 1990, guys. And yeah, he's fixing to make a statement that people don't even grasp today. Present and aorist tenses, as in the gnomic present and the gnomic aorist in Greek. So here he is already back then talking about the gnomic, both in the aorist and the present, that it's a timeless truth statement and not a reference to action and all of that, or active and passive voice in English. In each case, the simple point is that the author's use of a text is not irrelevant. While the author's role in every particular case is not equally clear, that role is nonetheless essential. And that brings us to the formal objections of T.S. Eliot on the one hand and William Wimsatt and Beardsley on the other. The latter objection, that an author does not necessarily succeed in communicating his meaning, is not germane to biblical interpretation, because the biblical text is the expression of the author's, capital, lowercase author's intention by definition. What the divine author intended to communicate, he succeeded in expressing in the text. Eliot's objection that the author's thoughts and feelings are irrelevant to the meaning requires more careful consideration. It is unfortunate that Hirsch did not answer this objection, but merely proposed that if Eliot's account were true, no criterion of validity would be possible. It would lead, Hirsch said, to meaning based on public consensus. Watch this, guys. This is going to get interesting. When no such consensus is possible. If a text means what it says, then it means nothing in particular. Its saying has no determinate existence, but must be the saying of the author or reader. While what Hirsch says makes sense, his critics are generally agreed that he failed to establish that the meaning of the text must be the author's intended meaning. If by intention we mean the reasoned expression of the author's composition, then intention is logically related to the meaning of the text. The logical argument goes like this. If the verbal sequence is a reasoned expression, and the reasoned expression is meaningful, then the verbal sequence is meaningful. If the verbal sequence is not a reasoned expression, and the reasoned expression is meaningful, then the verbal sequence is meaningless. P.D. Jewell has argued that in common practice we acknowledge the logic of meaning as the reasoned expression of an author. Unless we regard the text of a literary work as the record of someone's use of the words in question to say something, it would make no sense to attempt to seriously interpret it. If, for example, watch this is cool. If a parrot utters a syntactically or semantically deviant sentence, in other words, the parrot is saying something that it doesn't seem to make sense, then the question of interpreting it, of making sense of the parrot's utterance, clearly not going to arise. And surely the reason is that the parrot cannot, properly speaking, be said to have said anything. Yeah, because the parrot's not actually talking. He's not actually developing language. But if a child made the utterance, we would try to make sense of it, even if he or she violated the conventional rules of grammar. If there is a logical connection between the text and the author's intention, then the text cannot be separated from the author. Thus, by definition, the author's intention must not be separated from the text, because it guided the manner in which the text was expressed. There can be no message or meaning without the intended action of the author speaking or writing, and thus what the text says and what the author means are necessarily related. Objection number 4. The author's intention is an inaccessible goal and therefore a useless object of interpretation. This objection finds expression in what James Barr calls cultural relativism. Yeah, this is still around. Whereas historical perspective makes the goal unstable, cultural perspective makes the goal inaccessible because of the constitutional nature of cultural categories. By an extension of the great Kantian insight on which is ultimately based, interpretive perspectivism argues for the constitutive nature of cultural categories. The great Kantian insight is that man's experience is pre-accommodated to his categories of experience, i.e., our mental organization of what we perceive constitutes our experience. Our perspective is limited by our own cultural experience, and so we cannot fully understand the author's perspective. Barr has summarized the effect of cultural relativism. The Bible, like all other literature, is dependent on the cultural milieu. In fact, a plurality of cultural milieus in which it was written. Our modern culture is different, and it is not possible that the same work, the Bible, can have the same meaning as it had in its own cultural milieu. Any work or text composed in an ancient time and an ancient culture has its meaning in that time and that culture, and our time or culture may have a different meaning or indeed may have no meaning at all. In addition, with the concept of cultural separation, D.E. Nineham calls into question the original interpretation of historical events. We are still bound in integrity to ask whether if we, with our 20th century background, had been there, we should have felt the historical events in question to demand any explanation in supernatural terms. And we can be sure that if so, the terms we should have used would not have been the ones used by biblical writers. The biblical writers are understood to have been conditioned by their cultures to view death as an enemy, or by the idea of chaos that threatens to engulf the world, or by the notion of man as a body-soul entity. Thus, since ancient assumptions are different from ours, perception and interpretation will also be different. There are 3 arguments against the position that cultural relativism makes the author's meaning inaccessible. First, cultural perspective ultimately implies the verbal meaning exists only by virtue of the perspective that gives it existence. It follows that it's impossible to distort a meaning that cannot exist in the modern world. If body-soul existence is conditioned on the culture, and if these culture values are no longer shared, then body-soul existence is meaningless. Barr is correct in casting such view as radical. Second, from the viewpoint of biblical revelation, the authors and interpreters, despite cultural differences, have in common what is necessary to communicate. They are, by means of creation, made in the image of God. One aspect of God's image is the ability to communicate. Communication is by definition a sharing of meaning that occurs through public signs of language that have relationship to this meaning. The culturally public aspects of communication must be distinguished from the private and the culturally particular experience of writing. Meaning can be reduced even if the cultural experience is inaccessible. Third, ancient cultural writings merely represent a special case of communication with another person through writing. It is necessary to share facts of the language and assumptions in the culture so as not to miss allusions or to mistake the contemporary sense of words. But these are preliminary tasks and remain squarely in the public domain. While the task of interpretation is more difficult when dealing with ancient and culturally foreign writings, it's not impossible. Moreover, the nature of the Bible as divine revelation establishes the basis for a timeless character of its message, rather than time-bound message meaningful to one culture alone. Objection 5. Hey, theology scholar, Merry Christmas to you also. You don't want a wrench? I thought I gave you a wrench. You don't want one? Let me know. Objection number 5. The author's intention is trivial go because the construct of the author's intention is based on circular reasoning. Schleiermacher discussed the problems inherent in understanding by using the model of a hermeneutical circle. In essence, this concept states that the process of understanding is necessarily circular because we cannot know a whole without knowing some of its parts, yet we cannot know the parts as such without knowing the whole that determines their function. Similarly put, this means the understanding of a particular is always conditioned by an understanding of the whole. Schleiermacher's discussion of the technical and grammatical tasks was consistent in his early writings. Grammatical interpretation is the art of finding the precise sense of a given statement from its language and with the help of the language. We should construe the meaning from the total pre-given value of the language and the heritage common to the author and his reader. In Schleiermacher's later writings, however, the technical became psychological. Psychological interpretation is given priority when one regards language exclusively as a means by which a person communicates his thoughts. The interpreter seeks to put himself inside the author. Nothing in the passage is self-evident. The focus is not on the analysis of the passage, but on comprehension, the process of understanding. The hermeneutical circle function is summarized by Gadamer. According to this theory, the circular movement of understanding runs backwards and forwards along the text and disappears when it's perfectly understood. This view of understanding culminated logically in Schleiermacher's theory of the divinatory act, by means of which one places oneself entirely within the author's mind and from there resolves all that is strange and unusual about the text. Martin Heidegger enlarged this concept of the hermeneutical circle, and Gadamer sees this as a decisive turning point. Heidegger describes the circle in such a way that the understanding of the text remains permanently determined by the anticipatory movement of foreunderstanding by the interpreter, or pre-understanding. The circle of the whole and the part is not dissolved in perfect understanding, but on the contrary, is most fully realized. Heidegger described meaning in terms of horizons. He wrote, "Meaning is that the upon which of a projection in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. It gives structure from a forehaving, a foresight, and a foreconception." Heidegger uses the phrase horizon of understanding, which is the forehaving for which or upon which something is understandable as the thing it is. Gadamer understood this feature to be the core of Heidegger's theory of hermeneutics. The circle, then, is not formal in nature, it's neither subjective nor objective, but describes understanding as the interplay of the movement of tradition and the movement of the interpreter. The anticipation of meaning that governs our understanding of the text is not an act of subjectivity, but proceeds from communality that binds us to the tradition. But this is contained in our relationship to tradition and the constant process of tradition. So he says, so this hermeneutical circle begins in either the subjectivity of the private perspective of the psychological analysis of the author, like Schleiermacher, or in the historicity of the perspective of horizon and the tradition of the interpreter's knowledge, like Heidegger. But the ultimate ground of knowing is thereby made trivial, whether based on subjective or historical grounds. J.I. Packer suggests an alternative. So we were looking at wrong views, right? Now listen what Packer says. The exegetical circle, so this is in contrast to what they were calling the hermeneutical circle, a concept springing from recognition of the truth, for truth it is, that exegesis presupposes a hermeneutic, which in turn is drawn from overall theology, which theology is in turn rests on exegesis. This circle is not, of course, logically vicious. It is not the circle of presupposing what you ought to prove, but the circle, or rather the ascendant spiral, of successive approximation, a basic method of every science. I'm going to draw that out later on, chart that out, to make that more understandable. Thus, the ground for evangelical hermeneutics is biblical authority. It is evident in the clear statements of Scripture that in the words of resurrection of Jesus Christ, this is the starting point, the nature and truthfulness of biblical revelation and general view of this Christian truth. The understanding of particular text begins with a reading of the whole text, from which corrigible schemata, constructs of meaning subject to textual determination, are developed, which Hirsch calls this matchmaking constructed corrected process. The model of corrigible schemata, a more useful and accurate model than that of the so-called hermeneutical circle, unlike one alternable and inescapable pre-understanding and Heidegger's account of the hermeneutical circle, a schema can be radically altered and corrected. So, yeah, a schema is like a pattern, a way of viewing things. For example, whenever a kid is learning about cars, every time they see a vehicle with four wheels on the road, they're like, a car. But then the parents point to them, no, that's a van. That's a truck. And so what happens is they alter their schema. And that's what happens in Bible study. You do have a pre-understanding. You have preconceptions. But each time you're going back to the text, you can alter that schema. A schema sets up a range of predictions or expectations, which, if fulfilled, confirms the schema, but if not fulfilled, causes us to revise it. So the process of interpretation involves making a statement and then attempting to match the statement against the details of the text. When the details do not match, the statement must be corrected until there's correspondence. This approach acknowledges that the best evidence for the author's intended meaning is found in the text, although it is not the only evidence. Moreover, there is the interpreter's overall understanding of the Bible, which provides broader textual data of the divine author. This appeal to the text as the best evidence is not an appeal to interpretation of the text. It is an appeal to certain textual features that provide evidence for the meaning of the text, if and only if they're evidence of the author's intention. So the ultimate ground for authority is the textual particulars. The interpreter's understanding of the author's intention is a construct determined by the text, is subject to correction depending on matching with the textual particulars. Thus, basic doctrinal conclusions do remain as settled convictions because they rest in the clear teaching of the text and the combined understanding of the text by generations of spirit-led interpreters. Still, the ultimate ground of interpretation is the test of Scripture, which is revelation. In the ultimate sense, the hermeneutical circle is wrestling with the creatureliness of man and his capacity to know. On what does a finite creature ground or found his knowledge? Schleiermacher grounded it in intuitive and thus private identification with the author. Heidegger grounded it with being and historical existence of the interpreter. Packer ground human knowledge in the fact of God's self-revelation to mankind, as do we. Man's ground for knowing is God and the basic fact that he has spoken, or in Francis Schaeffer's phrase, God is there and he's not silent. Thus, the goal of reaching the author's intention is based not on circular reasoning, but on cumulative reason, a spiral rather than a circle. Objection number 6. The author's intention is a meaningless goal because the author often doesn't know what he means. Gadamer affirms Schleiermacher's maxim of hermeneutics. Schleiermacher asserts that the object is to understand a writer better than he understood himself. This statement concerns the whole problem of hermeneutics. In the history of interpretation, this maxim has yielded two main types of authorial ignorance. Schleiermacher understood authorial ignorance in relation to conscious and unconscious meaning of the author. This may be illustrated in the following conversation as related by Hirsch. This is funny. Watch this, guys. Did you know that the last two sentences of yours have parallel constructions which emphasize their similarity in meaning? No. How clever of me. I suppose I really did want to emphasize the similarity, though I wasn't aware of that, and I had no idea I was using rhetorical devices to do it. What this illustrates is that there are usually components of an author's intended meaning that he's not conscious of. This kind of understanding of a text can be called better, in that it is a more explicit, worked out to a greater degree knowledge of the text. It commonly occurs in exegesis when the interpreter refers to rules of grammar or literary forms that the author may have used without noticing them because he lived in the language. What must be made clear is that this better understanding does not refer to defining components of meaning expressed in the text, an aspect crucial to our goal of interpretation. These defining components are the basis for the reasoned expression of the text that came into existence in writing. These are held in common by the human and divine authors. The second kind of authorial ignorance is important because it provides a basic assumption of all higher criticism. This is authorial ignorance of subject matter due to a limitation in sources for historical issues or the limitations in perception because of cultural conditioning. It was in this sense that Kant and Fichte read Schleiermacher's maxim. In the spirit of rationalism, Schleiermacher claimed solely through thought, through the development and implications of an author's idea, to achieve insights that correspond to the real intention of the author, insights that he would have to share if his thinking had been clear enough. Gadamer also followed this approach. He stated the artist who creates something is not the ideal interpreter of it. As an interpreter, he has no automatic priority as an authority over the man who's simply receiving his work. Gadamer grounded his position not in the rationalism of Kant, but in the historicism of Heidegger. Indeed, instead of accepting at the stage of understanding the objective validity of what an author is saying, the interpreter sees the content of the text and the horizon of one's own foreunderstanding, which proceeds from being concerned about the same subject matter. Fusing an author's textual horizon with the reader's historical horizon thusly lends some concern to Anthony Thistleton's use of this model. Yeah, he's the one that does the two horizon thing. Understanding is not simply a matter of looking up individual words in a grammar and dictionary, but a communication between two sets of horizons. While the scope of interpretation is more than grammars and dictionaries, does interpretation ever involve altering and correcting the author's horizon? This form of authorial ignorance is inconsistent with biblical affirmations about the message expressed in the text. Although human authors share historical and cultural limitations, when they speak as prophets or apostles, they are borne along by the Holy Spirit. The product of the text is inerrant in all that it affirms. Thus, in biblical exegesis, such authorial ignorance is excluded by nature revelation. Finally, discussion of such authorial ignorance moves from the task of understanding to the task of evaluation. In this regard, the pursuit of higher criticism is not a tool of understanding, but a tool of criticism. It is an evaluation or criticism of the perceived truthfulness or relevance of text or meaning. Such evaluation has a place, but it's not part of communication. Objection number 7. The author's intention is an arbitrary goal since it's not the only genuinely discriminating norm. Pay attention to this one. This one's good, guys. In this objection, there's a division of opinion, even among allies of authorial intent, on the value of the author's intention in determining text or meaning. Hirsch argues consistently that the author's intended meaning is the only generally discriminating norm. Strangely, Joule challenges Hirsch's conception of the nature of go and posits that a group of distinguished literary critics would serve as an equally discriminating norm, because they could in practice undoubtedly resolve a larger number of interpretive controversies than appeal to the author's intention. So he's like, okay, guys, let's elect a group of people that are experts and they could be able to determine what the text means. Okay? This group will be appointed or elected to serve as arbiters in disputes about the meaning of literary works. Their majority vote would arbitrate the meaning. Hirsch, by contrast, argues that the myth of public consensus is based on a fundamental error of observation and logic. It is an empirical fact that such a consensus or group of arbiters does not exist except in the Roman Catholic system. Okay? You hear that, guys? However, the great contention raised against this comes from the basis of their selection and the merit of their interpretations. It is logical error to erect a stable normative concept, i.e. the public meaning, out of an unstable descriptive one. The public meaning and the distinguished critic's meaning are nothing more or less than those meanings that can happen to construe from the text. And there is no necessity or compulsion for acceptance. Either group could be wrong. In other words, you can reject the public consensus and you can reject the scholarly consensus. The issue involved in this selection of arbiters may be clarified by considering a series of questions. The first set of questions is this, and I'm going to slow down here. Who would choose the arbiters of interpretation? Okay? So let's just say that we wanted to make something where we have a list of scholars that do all of our interpretation for us and determine what the truth is. Well, who would we pick? Who does the Catholic Church pick? Then it says, would the mass of interpreters be expected to choose the arbiters? In other words, is it a democratic process? Would the mass of interpreters choose someone else because they are not expected to understand or they're not able to understand? In other words, if you can't understand the biblical, and this is how I'm understanding this, if you can't understand the biblical text to determine the meaning, what makes you think you can determine who's the better person to evaluate who are the arbitrators over the text to determine meaning? Because they're not expected to understand, they're able to understand. What would be the special qualification of the arbiter? Questions such as these make it clear that there is no necessary reason for who would be chosen, and that the choice of a certain individual is not necessary but rather optional. Then how could the group be considered a genuinely discriminating norm? In our legal system, there's a necessary basis for trial by jury, the inherent sense of fairness and morality found in common human beings in a society. But no such common sense of competence exists by which to necessarily choose a group of arbiters to judge textual meaning unless we, watch this guys, unless we accept the doctrine of apostolic succession and infallibility in interpretation. Okay? See, that's how the Catholics get away with it. Without a necessary competence in their interpretation, such a group will possess no compelling authority to justify their choice of meaning. So instead of relying on interpretation by a group of experts, it is preferable that individuals accept the responsibility to interpret as part of their relationship to God. In other words, the privacy of the priesthood believer. And that's my thing. I'd rather be held accountable for my personal study between me and God. And yeah, I fellowship with other believers and I learn from other believers, but I'd rather be held accountable than blindly follow someone and then later on find out that I'm held accountable for believing their lie without studying for myself. More questions follow. Thinking Scholar. He says, I think the idea of offshoring interpretation to the church and tradition is reasonable in most cases. We do this all the time with things we're unfamiliar with. Yeah, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with expert opinion, okay? And I even will say, I got particular scholars that I like in a particular field that I use like tools in a toolbox and contribute to my understanding of things. But there's a difference when you say that they're infallible and that they're the only ones with the authority. That's the problem. If the Catholic Church was just saying, we believe we got the best experts because we have been doing this all this time, here's our proven track record. If that was their argument, it would be a lot more acceptable. Then we could talk about, okay, well, let's evaluate your track record. Let's see how your interpretations were, what your pre-understanding was, what your presuppositions were. Let's evaluate all of that. And I'm fine with that. Like I said, the first exegesis book I ever read was by Catholic, by Michael Gorman. That's why it's so frustrating when Catholics or Orthodox want to shift the issue about the canon or about the authority issue. It's like, if you're wrong about salvation, your authority doesn't matter. You're wrong. So I'd rather focus on fighting that issue, free grace, which none of them have been able to cook, than wasting my time in those other areas. Hey, SP. More questions follow. How would these arbiters compel agreement with their interpretation? Compel, force, in other words, enforce it even. What intellectual or moral compulsion exists in the majority? Yeah, majority of who? The majority of scholars or the people that elected them? While our society might set up for living according to the will of the majority, why must our thought be so directed, particularly in the case when the majority interpretation is perceived to be inadequate or an error? In other words, just because we do things democratically doesn't mean that we need to approach this democratically or represented democracy, actually, more like this. By contrast, the author's intention compels agreement because he gave expression to the message, and in that activity set limit on the textual medium. It is not that the author pronounced the meaning as a flat declaration, as Jules implies. Rather, at a certain time in history, the author spoke and disclosed his meaning through textual clues. It is this discriminating and necessary norm that compels agreement in principle. In other words, the discriminatory and the thing that establishes the norm is the text, the textual clues. And that's why whenever you're talking about apostolic succession, infallibility, primacy, and all of that stuff, they always point to a text. Now, here's the key. They'll either point to the biblical text, they'll point to extra biblical literature, either in the Old Testament, or they'll point to church stuff. But regardless, they're always going to a text. So what they're doing is they're claiming their interpretation of all of those texts is correct. The Bible text, the historical text, and all of that. So by the very fact of them doing that, what they're doing is they're showing that the text of any kind has final authority. It is discriminating the necessary norm that compels agreement in principle. To gain agreement, in fact, demands a humble discussion and careful articulation of the reasons for valid interpretations. Objection number 8. The single meaning as the author's intention is an inconsistent goal because literary genre demands multiple meanings and critical practice demonstrates multiple interpretations. This criticism has arisen from the practice of structural exegesis. This position is expressed in Susan Wittig's theory of multiple meanings. Her central thesis is that the unstated signified in a parable is an invitation to a reader here to supply the realm of reference. In other words, if the parable doesn't tell you what something means, you're the one that's supposed to fill in the blanks. Her initial premise assumes that the text of the parable obviously is polyvalent. It does admit a variety of possible meanings. Wittig's premise has been sharply and repeatedly contested. For example, Joachim Jeremias concluded Adolf Jutscher not merely proved incontestably by hundreds of cases that allegorization leads to error, but also maintained the fundamental position that allegorization, is ultimately alien to the parable of Jesus. Jeremias himself sought to find a single meaning to recover the original meaning of the parables. The unstated signified, to what does Jesus refer when he talks about farming in the parable of the soils, was not an invitation to the hearer to supply his own realm of reference, but an invitation for the disciples to puzzle over the issue of reference, and if need be, to turn to the author for his intended reference in Mark 4. Thus, there's no model to be found in the Lord's parable for Wittig's theory of polyvalence. In fact, Wittig herself demonstrates the interpretive practice found in Jesus' reference to those who are outside. Those who are outside might well conclude that Jesus simply intended to talk about farming. This would clearly be irrelevant and confirm their prior rejection of the Christ. But this interpretation was not a viable alternative. Rather, Jesus provided the one interpretation of his intended meaning and was not given sanction to the equal validity of multiple interpretations and the ambiguity of the parable's reference. An even more fundamental problem arises when Wittig attempts to apply conclusions reached in her study of parables to any and all literary genres. Any genre other than a parable-like genre will include the signified directly stated. In narrative, the historical characters or events are mentioned directly, or in prophetic literature, the future is talked about directly. albeit with some vagueness. But she counters, it is likely that the signified owes as much to the meaning system in the mind of the perceiver as it does to the signifier itself. Then she explained the idea of a meaning system as being sought within the mind of the perceiver. Equally probable, a powerful, well-organized, and stable analytic system may generate a particular kind of significance, even though the structure of the second-order significator does not immediately suggest it, and even though the sender may not consciously intend the sign to be perceived as parabolic. Wow, that was a tough sentence to understand. The idea that the signified, in other words, that the meaning, resides in the mind of the hearer, assumes that the different readings of a text, as seen through either Buddhist or Christian, Freudian, or Marxist eyes, are equally valid, in fact encouraged. This particular application of Heideggerian hermeneutical circle pre-understanding and the generative capacity of the reader as an author of meaning illustrates interpretation that is historically grounded. Hey Quad, Merry Christmas. Thus, Witz's conclusion is clearly inconsistent with Christ's interpretation of the parables, let alone other passages and the disciples' interpretation in context. In addition, since textual clues to the realm of the reference are ignored, the realm of authority has been removed from the text to the interpreter and his pre-understanding. Conclusion. 3 fundamental questions have been raised in part 1. 2 of the questions were addressed in the goal of interpretation. The biblical text communicates a single unified textual meaning that is determined by the author's intention as expressed in the text. One question has not been addressed. How is this textual meaning to be interpreted? With the goal of interpretation established, the question of the strategy for reaching the goal need to be examined next. That will be the focus of part 2 and 3. And that's my favorite part, guys. But I got to go make the PowerPoint for that part. So we will let off right here. So yeah, I look forward to this next part, which is recognition, which is like souped up observation on steroids. So I'm going to slow down a whole lot and really get into it. I just had to go over some of the theoretical stuff because I want people to appreciate what we're actually talking about when we talk about literal interpretation. All it means is that the meaning is in the text. That's it. The whole issue about figures of speech, that's not the issue. The issue is the meaning is in the text, and that author's intent is expressed in the text. In other words, God didn't intend to communicate something but failed to communicate it. He's a perfect communicator. The meaning is in the text. That's what we're responsible to study at. The text is authoritative. Okay? No, there's no one that's an arbitrator over the text. The meaning is in the text, and there's context clues. We learned this like in 2nd, 3rd grade to look for context clues to understand words or things we don't understand. So the meaning is in the text. That's what we're going to be evaluating, doing recognition. But let me go, guys. Y'all check out more content if you want to back up and look at the previous stream. You know, the series on this, that's cool, or whatever. But as soon as I get finished with making this PowerPoint, I'll be up and running, because I believe the best thing we can be doing on Christmas, and of course there's lots of things people could be doing, but let me just say it this way. I believe the best thing that I can be doing on Christmas is giving y'all the gift of emphasizing God's word, because that's the only way we know God. Okay? So God bless, guys.